Which conversation process are we doing?
Go for moderator. I think that worked for many of us who were in the same group last time. Better than just randomly talking.
Someone want to be?
I can be moderator if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
By the way, you can also do moderator with additional things like chips or whatever, so just to know that these aren't mutually exclusive. So if you want to do chips also, you can just make sure you agree on that.
Should we physically move backwards?
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's necessary.
Well,
Doesn't hurt though.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Okay, who would like to start?
So just to clarify, we're weighing whether it's legally sound, whether it's politically sound. Those are the two questions.
I think you can give any opinion about any of the questions that you could write here.
Yeah.
You could write here.
Are we also going around and saying like what each of our topics are? If we go to one.
Or maybe you can just put your
Comment on
topic on the table.
Yeah,
Okay.
like if you want to talk out, like if someone has an idea for their essay, like
I have
any
a
of their
question.
pieces, sure, go.
I'm doing the essay on the last one. Respond to the original unit goal statement, which is John Marshall controversially interpreted Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, as well as Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, in order to avoid a direct ruling in the Marbury versus Madison case and pronounce the concept of judicial supremacy and the power of judicial review. My question would be, like, if I were writing a good essay that responds to this statement, what directly would I want to prove? And I think, like, what I'm planning on talking about is mostly about the concept of judicial supremacy and why he put it forth, like why it matters and why it is crucial to this ruling, because it makes his ruling right, quote unquote. And I was just wondering, like, where are places that there could be a wrench into that argument that I could try to tackle, and then where are places that I could, like, actually argue within that? Yeah.
Alright, so I actually saw the prompt differently. It seems to me that saying why he may have done it is perhaps beyond the scope. It might not be. It definitely would make sense to talk about why if you're talking about whether yes or no.
I'm more saying how, I guess, than why. Yeah.
Alright, then that makes more sense. Great.
Well, the last part that says the concept of judicial supremacy and the power of judicial review, I think I remember that in one of our previous classes we talked about whether by nature of the president having the power to enforce laws, that by nature is in some way judicial review, and that potentially a wrench that could be thrown in it is that if someone would claim that only the Supreme Court has judicial supremacy, well, isn't inherent in someone who's enforcing the laws, isn't that by choosing which laws you enforce, that in some way is deciding whether or not something is constitutional.
Yeah.
Is whether or not you're going to abide by that. So maybe that could be
So I guess I'd have to prove, like, why John Marshall actually was capable of outfoxing Jefferson in that, like, because Jefferson could have just not enforced this rule. Like, there must have been a way that Marshall was able to do this that was...
Well, I guess that just someone else can jump in, but just if that prompts the question, is judicial supremacy solely part of the Supreme Court, or whether it
Well, isn't that a different question? An essay question?
I mean, isn't judicial supremacy by definition part of the court? Judicial review isn't necessarily part of the court, but judicial supremacy is by definition, that means that only the court does judicial review, right?
Yes.
Wait, what's your question?
Yes, that is.
Yeah.
what-
Is that by nature of what is in the SCOTUS, you're saying?
The
Yeah.
definition of judicial, I was just trying to clarify what you said. I thought you said that something about judicial supremacy being in different branches, but by definition, it's only part of the judicial branch of power.
Well, supremacy.
Yes, the supremacy does mean that only the judicial branch has the power of review there. So, if you're saying that it's pronounced the concept of, that Marshall pronounced the concept of judicial supremacy, or you're talking about whether or not he did, you can and I would think should bring up the idea of executive orders and the executive branch's ability to interpret the laws.
I think that your question, the question that you asked, that is judicial supremacy the heart of Marshall's ruling, I think that's not an encompassing answer to this prompt.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that if you want to answer this prompt correctly, you have to really say why each part of it is correct. Say why it is controversial the way he interpreted it. Say what the both sides are, and then you can dive into the judicial supremacy part.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily
That
One is
actually,
given.
that's helpful. That's good.
like touch each part of the question.
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have a paper topic that they would like to go over?
I think the topic, so I'm just using the basic questions that are on the first side, but I think the claim that I want to make is that it was not a legally sound decision in this case for a number of reasons, which I guess I can go into, but it was politically sound, and technically judicial review is constitutional. It's just that the way that Marshall read this case was not fully legal, I guess, if that makes sense.
I have a building off question. Does anyone disapprove of this politically?
Of judicial review?
Does anyone disapprove?
Of this case.
Of the ruling of this
Yeah.
case.
Oh, yeah.
What, can you talk about that?
I mean, or like I could explain how to disapprove this.
Sure.
Yeah, like the two reasons. First of all, Marshall is entrenched in this as a political issue because he's a Federalist, and because he is the reason why this case exists, because he failed to do something as Secretary of State before being promoted. So you could say that the ruling in this case is a political move to save his own ass, and also as a screw you to Jefferson just because he hates Jefferson, and that like to disapprove of this case politically would basically be to say like that this case is extremely weighted in a Federalist versus Democratic Republican disagreement that both Jefferson, Madison, and Marshall have way too much stakes in for this to be purely about justice.
I think my question was more about, do you think politically that something like judicial review should exist?
I thought
That's what I
specific.
understand this question to mean from the prompt. Is do you approve of this decision politically? Is the outcome is that judicial review now exists, judicial supremacy now exists? Do you agree with that?
But wouldn't the political outcome be a certain effect or divide on the political sphere?
Well, I don't think I could write an essay on like federalism versus democratic republicans and like why one side
But
is
you
better.
can really talk about like the personal ties to this case.
Just want to point out that we're
Oh,
no
sorry.
longer raising hands whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think I was the only one who was doing that anyway.
If someone wants to jump in.
What do you think about the political question?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, like, I didn't know, like, how to read it, if it meant, like, do you think that, like, I didn't know entirely how to read it, like, I guess if you're reading it in the way that Jacob mentioned, which is, like, do you think that, if I, like, understood what you said, or were you saying that, like, do you think a system like judicial review should exist?
That's what I understood.
Okay, so, like, if I'm answering the question that way, then I'd think yes, a system like judicial review should exist. Although I'm not, like, I feel like there are a lot of different ways how you could read that question, and I'm not entirely sure how to read that question. So if anyone has, like, other ideas, I don't know if I'm supposed to call.
Oh, okay. Well,
Leanna, go.
okay. So, how I interpreted that question was like, do you think that the way Marshall ruled was the right way to rule on the case? Not just talking about judicial review, but talking about like the bind that he's in, that like can't, like, there's problems if he answers yes, and there's problems if he says no. So, like, I interpret it as, do you approve of the way he interpreted the case?
Yes.
Or, like, he said yes or no.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm just wondering whether, are any of these topics meant to be, when it says, do you approve of the decision politically, does that mean, like, do I, Elliot, approve
Yeah.
of his decision and with my political views of, like, today? Or does this saying, do I think that Marshall made the right decision for himself and his situation in 1803? Like, which one is it, like, are these questions all about our views, or are they about what we think if Marshall made the right decision?
I think it's the how would I, Elliot, read it, because it says, do you believe the ends justify the means in the question? It doesn't say, do you believe that Marshall got himself out of the bind in the best way possible?
Yeah, I just think, like, just knowing Mr. Cadden, I think it would be okay to read.
That's how you should write a paper, by the
No,
way.
I
Just trying to get inside my head as much as you can. Yeah.
Like, I think he'd be okay with you reading this question either way, as long as the essay you write is, like, cohesive and is answering that question. So if
I think that is fair to say.
If Hadass is choosing this question, maybe she should say how she interprets it, and then we should focus more on how she can write that essay the best as possible. Because if we're just debating on what the question means, then Hadass doesn't walk away with much help on what to write.
But like, something specific about this question that I was confused about was, if you do say, okay, the ends justify the means, that I like judicial review, because I feel like a lot of us have said, oh, judicial review makes a lot of sense, it's so great, it gives the Supreme Court power, but I don't really like the means in which they got there. I don't really, if someone could help me see, how do you fight against that? Like, say it's completely not legally sound, but I like the way it turned out, therefore I want to keep it around. Like, how do you can't, I feel like you can't make an argument around that. How do you fix that?
I mean, I think that if you're writing that paper, that would be the whole point of the paper, is to sort of reconcile your feelings that the case was ruled on incorrectly with the idea that you think judicial review is constitutionally good. I think that would be the idea of the paper, would be to try to, like, reconcile your feelings between those two conflicting things.
And like with that, you can analyze, like you can go through the steps of like how Marshall made his decision, and like you can kind of like tie in like if you would agree with that. So you can like look at all like the specific choices that he made, and I think that could help you decide like if in the end it justifies that.
What are you reading the paper about?
How much I was thinking about, I find the whole thing about like the exceptions clause really interesting, just because there are different ways to read it, and like how you read it could change like if Marshall was doing it correctly or if he wasn't. So I was thinking about doing something with that.
What's one way that you thought was an interesting way of reading it?
Well, I think just like, well, there's the whole part about adding, and like, does Congress have the opportunity to add additional original jurisdiction cases, or like you could also read it as like, do they have the opportunity to like take away like what is included?
Anybody else have anything to say, or another paper topic they want to go over?
I have a question. Do people think that a justice needs to be consistent across his or her ruling? Because I can see it both ways, that like people change their mind and it's reasonable to give leeway, but I can also see it as if something was constitutional one day and the Constitution hasn't changed, shouldn't it still be constitutional? How could that be something? Someone wants to get that.
Okay, I think it has a lot to do with like intention. Maybe if like that's what you were talking about, like maybe like because like if someone changes their mind and they actually believe that it's something else, then I think that's okay to rule on two things different. But if it's only for political reasons, you can talk about that, how that's very different than if you completely change your view, or if you're ruling on it so it has like standing on a future case, so they're standing for a future case, not standing, so there's a precedence for a future case, or something like that.
Couldn't it be more about whether, like, I feel like because the Supreme Court affects the society, couldn't this, I feel like the more important question is if the society changes, whether a justice has to be consistent. Like whether, even if they stay the same and the Constitution stays the same and their interpretation stays the same, but the society needs something new, how you deal with that.
All right. So, group 1, you will pick up your conversation or whatever conversation you want tomorrow. Group 2, you'll begin in a moment. I just wanted to, I don't know if you guys are aware of what I've been doing in terms of note-taking. I'm just trying to take things you guys have said and turn them into questions. I'll email this to you. All right, group 2. Here's what I would have you guys do just to start, is to think about what, did the first seminar, like, would you want your seminar to look that way? If you would like to look differently in terms of the process, in terms of the discussion, in terms of, like, the content or whatever, be mindful of that and assertive about what kind of seminar you would like to see and how you would like to make that happen. And I'm talking about space, I'm talking about disagreement, yeah. So, who is group 2? Just raise your hands for me now, please. Thank you. Okay, so group 2.
I think what they did actually last time was good to have a moderator, but not just wait each time for a person to raise their, like, just have a moderator so in case the conversation gets out of hand, we have somebody to stop it and pick on somebody new.
Did you guys do chips? I don't even know if that happened.
But I think as we go, like, we can just rely on people to give each other space, and we should pick somebody to be the ultimate decider.
All right, I'm gonna just say experiment with chips. So take out a piece of paper. No, you can do that too. They're not mutually exclusive. Go with that, David. That's fine. But everybody, just take out a piece of paper, fold it into a square, and
Wait, what do you mean by making it?
I know you like guys.
yeah, like that. Yep.
I don't hate the environment.
And so just Gilad, could you oh wait, actually look. Guys. Okay.
You're wrong.
Thank you. Can you model for us what it would look like to put your chip out, please? Thank you.
Can you see that?
Can everybody see that?
But it would be because I have a lot of paper.
Take your
I
paper
know.
back and
I
scan
have like brightly colored stick.
What if you fold them?
Oh, I have sticky notes.
Oh.
Wait.
Oh, yay!
Haha.
So take, there we go. Yahoo, nice. See, I told you guys would come up with something better. Here we go.
Good idea, Maya.
But Mr. Cat, it's kind of hard to like see from here all the way down there.
Gila, can you put yours out and see if Eliezer can see it?
That is how we talked about it.
Oh, Chava, are you in this group? Okay, guys, can I ask that everybody guys, can you take stuff, Jacob, you have, that thing is, somebody's, that is blocking, yeah, so anything that's going to block people's view of a sticky note, move it.
Yes.
Whose black thing is that? Yeah, thank you.
Who's else?
Okay.
It has a name.
Oh, you're such a bad person. Oh my God. All right. Group 2. Is everybody ready? Okay, go for it.
Wait, so did we decide we want a moderator just in
I'm willing to be a moderator if anything goes crazy.
I
Yeah,
got
you wanna be a
it.
moderator but like loose?
I'll be a loose moderator.
Nice.
Yeah.
Alright.
Yeah, you're there.
I'm really starting the conversation.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm aware. Oh. So my question is, that I've been thinking about is, can there be judicial supremacy if the Supreme Court has no control over the army and can't write laws? Like, I think me and Ben were talking about this the other day, like, at the end of the day, the executive can always override the Supreme Court with basically use of force. And also, like, the Supreme Court has no ability to really dictate what the executive does, because, like, if the executive does something that the Supreme Court rules unconstitutional, what does the Supreme Court do about it besides just saying it's unconstitutional? So, like, so even if the Supreme Court has judicial supremacy under the way that, the way the Constitution's written, does it, like, I feel like it doesn't actually have judicial supremacy.
Where is it? So his go out first and then I'll just
So I think there, like you're saying, there can't exactly be judicial supremacy, but it takes all three branches actually trusting each other. Like, the legislative and executive branch actually have to listen to judicial decisions, or else it just doesn't work. And like an example of that not working is like Andrew Jackson just ignored the Supreme Court's decision about I forgot what the case was, something versus Georgia, like the Cherokee case. So it only works if the other branches actually listen to decisions, or else it's not supreme.
I just have a clarifying question. Are you saying that, are you asking whether or not the executive branch should be able to pick and choose what they follow and if they don't, or are you saying since they already have that power, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, well, since they already have that power, like, I think both, like they do have that power, like, but the fact of it is that the executive can ignore, and I guess I'd be curious to think what you think of, should they ignore the judicial in some cases?
Well, so I think this would be something that you should put in your papers, that you should definitely talk about whether or not you think they should. And so I think that, I don't think that the executive branch should ever have a choice in which laws they follow and which laws they don't, because I think that if they do, then you sort of, then you lose the checks and balances system that each branch has. Because if the executive branch, if they can just choose like whichever law they want to enforce and not enforce, then you're basically running the country based on the views of like one person, and that's not a very democratic system.
But then the question is also, do we think that the Supreme Court should have judicial supremacy, that like in all scenarios, whatever the president does has to abide by what the Supreme Court says in all scenarios, whatever the states do have to abide by what the Supreme Court says, like whether or not that's plausible because the president could just do whatever they want, is that, do we think that would be ideal?
I have a clarifying question. Are you saying that you don't think it's possible for the judicial branch to ever have judicial supremacy because of the executive branch?
And well, partly because of the executive, because the executive entirely kind of controls what cases come to them. If they don't arrest somebody, nothing gets to the Supreme Court. And also in the end, like they don't really, like, it's not like they're striking laws off the books. Like Congress can still write laws that are unconstitutional. Just the question of whether or not it's just a question. The Supreme Court can say they're unconstitutional, but what does that really mean? Like, and what it does mean is that, like, if the executive arrests somebody that was arrested under unconstitutional law, the court system would never actually prosecute that person. But the executive can still. So basically, what I think it is the executive can't enforce laws that are unconstitutional, but they can also choose to not enforce laws that they think, like, if the Supreme Court says something is constitutional and the executive thinks it's not, they can choose to not enforce that, because if they don't bring anyone to the courts, then the courts really have no power. They have no ability to rule on those cases.
So I had a question about like what kind of laws are being ruled on. I guess by the executive, like is it? You said that they can choose to enforce. They can choose to not enforce constitutional laws. Does that mean that like laws, like a positive law that's like, to be enforced? I guess, and they can like, just like choose, or is it like something like you're not supposed to do that because?
Right, so like a law, yeah, like a law like that says like, for example, like you can't burn the flag. The executive, if the court rules that that law is unconstitutional, then the executive can bring people that burn the flag to the court, but it won't matter because the court will just instantly dismiss those cases, even in trial courts, because the trial courts do follow the Supreme Court. But if the court said that burning the flag, a law against burning the flag is constitutional, the executive can decide, I don't think that's constitutional, and we're not going to arrest anyone that burnt the flag, and there's nothing that the courts can do about it. I mean, they could write a writ of mandamus, but like again, we talked about this, like what a writ of mandamus still doesn't do anything without the executive power.
I have a clarifying question for you, David.
Yeah.
Are you saying that in reality, even though like most people would probably argue that the Supreme Court has judicial supremacy, are you arguing that actually it's the executive branch that has it?
I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want other people to talk, but no, because I think basically what my beliefs are, and I think I'm holding firm to them right now, is that the Supreme Court has judicial supremacy in the sense that we need somebody in this country to be the final say on the Constitution, but that doesn't no one else, like they are right, they are basically always right about what they say about the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that the other branches can't interpret the Constitution in their own way. And the public has the knowledge that they're interpreting the Constitution against the will of the Supreme Court, so they can not vote for them. And also, So I don't think the executive in that case would have judicial supremacy, because if they decide that something's not constitutional, it's just within their branch. In the same way that most of the time that I think the Supreme Court decides something's not constitutional, it only really affects that branch. Like the way we think of it today is it affects all branches of government, but it doesn't actually. Like the law isn't struck off the books.
Mm-hmm.
The executive doesn't have to do anything.
Oh, makes sense.
I missed the conversation yesterday, so I don't know how much was said about this, but I'd love to bring up like what we think about Marshall's sort of contradictions about what he says about what is constitutional and what isn't across different cases. I want to speak to that. It's Adam.
Oh,
It's
No one can see his post.
I put up my chip.
Adam, would you like to say something?
So something that, so what Aguilar said, something that I've kind of struggled with, which is how can I sort of take Marshall's rulings, like in a good way, I guess, if he seems to contradict himself multiple times. And something that I've sort of come to terms with is that he's just ruling not for what he actually thinks is right, except to keep in allegiance with his party. Like I believe that he doesn't actually think that a Judiciary Act is not constitutional. Like I don't think he actually thinks that, except I think that he's smart enough to understand that it's a necessary thing. And I think that the other rulings that he gives are sort of proof for that, where there are federalist things like the bank that he could easily made the argument that's valid one that's not unconstitutional, and he doesn't, and he contradicts himself. So I see him as just like someone who's very partisan.
So does it matter what the justice actually thinks? Like if he actually thought it was constitutional, but just thought it would be a better idea to say it's not? Does that matter?
I don't think so.
Well, so that, are you focusing on the question of, do you like approve of the decision politically?
That's not what I'm writing my paper on, but like that's a question that interests me. I think I'm writing my paper on, I forget the exact question, but about sort of further exploring who can do the judicial review, thank you. And whether or not only one party or one branch should have the power to do that.
I thought that.
So we kind of talking about like whether the rulings were like valid or not, and whether we should like follow them. So I think that like at this point, I think it's gone to a point where it's worked well to this day. So you can kind of just disregard precedent. I mean, it's become precedent because it's been working well in practice. Like, it's not been. I mean, that does raise a question because we are basing our tax system off of the Constitution. But I mean, at least for this one specific thing, it's worked well. But I would like to know.
Is that criteria for whether or not it stays though, if it's working?
Exactly.
That's the real question. Because first of all, what is working well? You know, I'm sure you can find a lot of people who tell you that it's not working well. I'm not saying that it isn't, but it's more of a subjective thing. I think it's not a perfect system. So I think whether or not it's constitutional can affect. I don't know if it would affect it, but I don't know if necessarily working well is what would, end the argument, so to say.
I mean, I think the question is especially pertinent now because I think the judiciary, in my opinion, has historical power that they, recently there's a lot of, the judiciary now is some of the most powerful it's ever been. Like, if you look at the election, people were purely voting for Donald Trump just so he could put a Supreme Court justice into power for his party. So the question is that, I think my question would be, and I wonder this myself, is that kind of a bad thing? Is it bad that people? I think it's kind of clear that now the judiciary does have more power than the executive. If you're voting for an executive because of the judiciary, I feel like one is higher. I don't know.
Yeah, the president's exhibit in the American Museum of Natural History in DC, it's they list 5 chief obligations of the president, and one of the top 5 is just nominating Supreme Court justices. And if that's one of his primary jobs, then it begs the question: is the judiciary branch significantly more powerful than anything?
A lot of people actually consider that the check on the judicial branch is the fact that the president appoints the justices.
Right, but once he appoints them, he can't
there
review
isn't any
anything.
checks once they're on them.
The Congress can impeach them.
For very specific
Yeah.
high crimes and
Just
misdemeanors.
'cause they
That
don't.
might be the most general statement of all time.
Yeah,
It could be
sorry,
anything.
not specific, but most people
Not
don't
emotional
commit high
harm.
crimes or misdemeanors.
Yes. It doesn't say you can impeach them for making the wrong decision in a court case.
If you guys don't mind, I think I really want to go over the first question of the current topic. When should a justice recuse themselves from the case? Because we see there's so many different times where it's why is John Marshall recusing himself now? Why not then? And
Yeah.
I think that's part of what makes this not a legally sound case, is that he is, way too involved to be able to rule fairly.
Why is that not legally sound? Because he's the one who makes the decision whether or not he should recuse himself. So maybe morally sound, or is that
Well, I think morals plays into laws, and the reason why a justice would recuse themselves is if they're connected to the case, and he clearly was.
But because
which is a moral decision.
Because he didn't recuse himself, does that make it not legally sound? Should we
I think that's part of why.
should it be ignored because we think he should have recused himself?
I don't think it should be ignored. I think it's the right political stance.
All right. So here's what I'm going to have you guys do. I want you to think about